Islam, and there's really two major branches, and they're the Sunnis and the Shiites. And we discussed the development of this a little bit before, but just to give you a reminder, the main difference between the Sunnis and the Shiites is really more of a political difference than a theological difference, in that the Sunnis accept the leadership of the first four caliphs, or the first four successors of Muhammad, whereas the Shiites do not accept those first four leaders and their successors. They only accept the fourth caliph. His name was Ali, and they accept his leadership because he was related to Muhammad through the marriage of one of Muhammad's daughters. And therefore, they believe only Ali and his successors are the rightful leaders within Islam, and therefore those two groups have been separated for many hundreds of years. And today, Islam is made up about 90% of Sunnis and about 10% of Shiites. And the largest concentration of Shiites is in Iran. There's another group within Islam that you might hear something about sometimes, and these are the Sufis. The Sufis actually can be in multiple different groups or wings of Islam. They sort of cross over. But this is a mystical group of Muslims, and they've been known for asceticism as well as mystical practices that they have, believing that you can have direct communion with God through mystical practices. And like I said, they can be found in various branches of Islam. They're not limited to one particular group. Another important thing to talk about when it comes to Muslim beliefs and practices is tradition. You might be surprised to know that the Quran is not the only authoritative writing within Islam. In fact, it's the primary book, it's the primary scriptures, but there's also authoritative traditions, which are called the Hadith and the Sunnah. And sometimes these words, Hadith and Sunnah, they refer to different bodies of traditions, but sometimes those words are used interchangeably. But these are bodies of tradition which talk about the life of Muhammad and his teachings, what he taught, what he did, all that kind of stuff. And after Muhammad's death, there were a variety of these traditions floating around. And so after Muhammad's death, Islamic scholars began to compile these traditions about Muhammad and about his teachings, and they put them into different collections and bodies of teaching. And so as they compiled these, they created multiple collections, which are called which now fit into these groups of the Hadith and the Sunnah. And these written traditions play a huge role within Islam today. And they play a big role for a couple of reasons. First of all, they provide an explanation and somewhat interpretation of the Quran. In this way, they function a lot like the Jewish midrash, or the Jewish rabbinic tradition, in the sense that within Judaism you have this midrash or rabbinic tradition which helps you interpret the Torah. In the same way, within Islam, where there's ambiguity about ethics or morals, the Hadith and the Sunnah kind of elaborate on those things and interpret those things. But secondly, another important thing that's important about these traditions within Islam is that they contain many of the distinctive laws and customs within Islam. So interestingly enough, a lot of the distinctive laws and customs that you find in Islam aren't necessarily even in the Quran, but they come out of the Hadith and the Sunnah, these authoritative traditions that you find. And so that's a very key component to understand as well. And then that leads into this next category, which is not tradition, but law. And the word law, you may be familiar with, which in Islam is called Sharia. You often hear this idea of Sharia in connection to Islam, and what it refers to is that it's the religious law or moral code within Islam. Now, just like the Hadith and the Sunnah, the Sharia was formed after the death of Muhammad, and that took about 200 years, and it was more or less completed by the year 850. And what the Sharia is based on is it's based on the Quran and it's based on the Sunnah, one of those traditions that we just discussed. Now, as far as Sharia is concerned, there's really no distinction between life in the religious community and life in the secular world. So Sharia contains secular laws which apply to society, But it also contains personal laws pertaining to the Muslim faith, such as laws about sex and marriage and divorce and diet and prayer and those kinds of things as well. So what's interesting to note is that Sharia is applied in a variety of different ways in Muslim countries today. Some Muslim countries have their own secular laws, and therefore Sharia plays no role in their judicial system. In some other countries, Sharia applies in personal status issues like marriage or divorce or inheritance or child custody, things like that, but they otherwise have no role in the secular legal system. And then a third category is that in some other countries, Sharia applies in full. It applies to both personal status as well as criminal proceedings. And then still other countries apply it differently based on the region. So it's difficult to generalize how Sharia is applied today because it's applied differently in different countries. And therefore you would find some Muslims who are content to live under secular judicial systems and not have Sharia applied. And then you'd have other Muslims who would want to apply Sharia in full and who would live in countries where it's applied in full and who would even be proponents of spreading Sharia to more regions as well. And that's part of the Islamist movement across the globe. So it's difficult to generalize, but Sharia is the Islamic law which is applied in different ways. Finally, to kind of come to a conclusion here, I want to say a quick word about weekly worship. The central place for worship in Islam is, of course, the mosque. And mosques are not only a place for worship and prayer, but they're also a place for community within Islam. And most mosques have what's called a minaret, which is the tower that you see on a mosque, and it has a staircase to the top. And from the top of a minaret is where the call to prayer is given. And if you've been in a city before that's a Muslim majority city, you'll often hear these calls to prayer that are given over a loudspeaker from the minaret, calling Muslims to their daily prayers. Muslim prayers can be carried out privately, like I said a few minutes ago, but they can also be carried out at the mosque, and they're often encouraged to carry out their daily prayers at the mosque if they're able to. And then in addition to those daily prayers, Friday is a day of community prayers and a sermon. So that would be somewhat like a weekly worship service for Muslims. On Friday, when they would go to the mosque, they would have prayers that were led by the local religious leader or the imam, and then there would be a sermon as well. Now, within Islam, there's no sense of sort of ordained clergy like we would understand ordained religious leaders, but they do have many still significant religious leaders who lead the Muslim community and who train other leaders in the faith as well. So let's make some concluding or closing observations here then, based on some of what we've seen about Islamic beliefs and practices. First of all, one just review point is that we need to understand that Islam has a fundamentally different view of God than Christianity. I think it's very important to understand. We live in a world where people want to say that all religions believe the same thing, that all paths lead to the same place, that people worship gods that are called different names, but it's really all just referring to the same God. And yet, as we look at Islam and we look at Christianity, there's a fundamentally different view of God, that Islam has a view of God that is transcendent, that is impersonal, that you can't really know, a God that's not triune. In fact, they reject the Trinity, and therefore it's a very, very different understanding of God than Christianity. But secondly, we saw that Islam has a fundamentally different view of Jesus than Christianity. Muslims have a high view of Jesus as a prophet, but that's where it stops within Islam. They reject the idea that Jesus was the Son of God. They reject the idea that Jesus died on the cross for our sins, or that he died on the cross at all. And in doing this, there's a fundamental contradiction between what Christians affirm here and what Muslims affirm. In that Christians affirm Jesus was God, Muslims affirm that Jesus was not God. He was just a mere prophet. And by doing so, and also by rejecting the idea of the resurrection, Muslims are going against the grain of the New Testament as well as historical scholarship. And then thirdly, we saw that Islam has a fundamentally different view of salvation than Christianity. In fact, really the two views of salvation are completely the exact opposite. On the one hand, Islam says that you are saved by your works. You go to heaven based on how many good works you do versus how many bad works you do. And the gospel teaches the exact opposite of that. The gospel is the exact opposite. In fact, the gospel says that if we weighed our good works versus our bad works on a scale, we would all be in hell, because no one has the power to save themselves. No one has the power to save themselves by works. We've all sinned and fall short of the glory of God. Therefore, if we measure ourselves based on how Islam seeks to measure us, we would all be in hell. But the gospel says that the good news is that we're not saved by our works. We're saved by what Christ has done for us, that He has taken our sin away, and He lived a perfect life. And it's because of His good works that are applied to us that we can be saved. It's totally by a gift of His grace and not by His works, and that all we can do is receive it by faith. So we can see then that the view of salvation between Islam and Christianity is fundamentally different. It's opposite. And so the fourth point that we can make then, because of these differences, because these two religions have such contradictory views, we would have to conclude that one of these two is mistaken. Either Christianity or Islam is wrong. They cannot be both right at the same time. Again, we live in a world where many people would seek to argue that all religions are equally valid, and yet that just simply cannot be logically true. It's impossible, because religions make mutually exclusive and competing truth claims. For example, Christianity says that Jesus is God. Islam says Jesus is not God. It's logically impossible for those two things to be true at the same time. One of them is mistaken. And I would just close by saying, as we've seen during this series, and as we'll continue to talk about as we explore these issues, Christianity has much more credibility behind it because of the testimony of the Gospels and the testimony and credibility of the Scriptures that we've seen. Once again, we see that what Islam claims and what the Quran claims is totally in contrast and in contradiction to what the New Testament and the Gospels affirm about who Jesus Christ is. And once again, we would have to say that the Gospels, which were written by eyewitnesses, people who knew Jesus, who walked with Jesus, and who talked with Jesus, have a very high degree of credibility and consistency, and have been tried and tested and can be trusted for 2,000 years. And yet, at the same time, we've seen that the Quran is filled with flaws and has many problems and contradictions. And therefore, there really can be no contest here, in that we see that the testimony that the Gospels give us, the testimony that the New Testament gives us about who Jesus is, about who God is, and about the Gospel and what salvation is all about, is really the true testimony that we need to understand and we need to receive. We're going to continue to explore these issues next week. As we finish this part of the series next week, we're going to talk about how do we respond to Islam and how do we share our faith with Islam, with Muslims. How can we reach out to them and share the gospel with them? And we're going to be thinking about what is it that Christians can do and how can we explain these important truths to them. So I hope you will join us next week as we talk about responding to Islam and how Christians can live out our faith and reach out to our Muslim neighbors.